to another Class Unity speaker event. Class Unity is a Marxist organization that supports class struggle politics here in the United States. We believe in class politics, not identity politics, and our ultimate aim is to build a coalition that would form a workers' party here in the United States. If you want to support us, please consider making a donation or even better, joining us by going to our website, classunity.org. We have a couple of upcoming events I want to plug before we get started. On Saturday, June 1st, we're speaking to Vivek Chibber on his latest book, The Class Matrix. And on July 7th, we are starting a new reading group course on the 2008 financial crisis. That is starting Sunday, July 7th at 3 p.m. Eastern. Our political education program is concerned with promoting materialist analysis on politics, economics, and social issues. And as part of that is our speaker series. Today, we'll be speaking to Gary Roth, who is a lecturer in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Rutgers University in Newark. He's the author of The Educated Underclass and Marxism in a Lost Century, a biography of Paul Mattick. He'll be talking to us about his recent work, The Educated Underclass, about the education system and new developments in the middle class. So thank you, Gary, for coming to talk to us. Could you introduce your book? What is it about, and what is so important about this topic?
Sure. My book is called The Educated Underclass, and I was interested in the issue, really, of what happens to college graduates after graduates of four-year colleges. What happens to them after they finish their degree? And I'd been a higher education administrator and taught for many years. And, students had a tendency to disappear after they graduated. Some kept in touch, particularly, when they needed a reference or so. But what I saw with some students was really great frustration trying to launch themselves into the job market. And so the book was really a way to analyze what happens to college graduates as a means to then understand how the working class is being reconfigured and how it has been reconfigured, particularly in terms of the expansion of higher education. And so I've put together a presentation today that addresses those themes. What I'd like to do is actually walk you through some data slides and then talk about both about the extent to which the working class is now a college-educated working class, and then also to talk about some of the ideas and ideologies that this kind of college-educated proletariat has adapted for itself. And so really kind of talk about demography and ideology as a presentation.
Would you like to share your?
Yeah, that would be great, because I put together some PowerPoint slides to walk you through. Yeah, good. You can see that? My slide?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay,
yep.
Great. So yes, a few kind of interconnected themes. One is the expansion of higher education and what that's meant for reshaping the working class, and then talking about a working class that to a significant extent is now college educated, and then also kind of multiculturalism as an expression of that transformation within the working class. And all this happens at a time when I think intellectual life, to a great extent in the United States, has been recentered in academic institutions, and that there's, the fact that we now talk about public intellectuals is kind of an expression that, intellectuals don't. There's not a center of gravity in terms of intellectuals and the formation of ideology outside of academic institutions. So this first chart, and Daniel and Adam, you've seen these charts before from when I was in Bowling Green, but I want to walk you through some of the data because it really contextualizes the situation. So that top bar, this chart breaks down everyone between the ages of 25 to 34. And so if you work with, for instance, a kind of Occupy-inspired definition of the working class, as the 99%, then really any demographic data of the population is a description of the working class. And so, assuming that just for a minute, what this shows is you just take a look at 25 to 34-year-olds, and that top bar represents data from 2021. So that's the latest data that we have. For 2 out of 5 25 to 34-year-olds now have a bachelor's degree or higher or more. And of that group, about 40% of that 41% has a graduate degree. But if you then take a look at, the percent of that cohort with a bachelor's degree or who have gone to college or have an associate's degree, so really taking into account everyone who's been a college student, then we're talking about 2/3 of that age cohort. So it's a significant number of people. And if you look at the fourth bar down, 1990, you can see that there's been a really very significant shift towards higher education over the last several decades. So it's a transformation that college education, the expansion of higher education, is often talked about as a Keynesian phenomenon in the post-World War II era. But there's been significant expansion of higher ed over the course of the last few decades. And so, we're now in a situation where basically 2 out of 3 high school graduates now go on to college for some amount of time. So overall, the population has had some amount of college experience. So now, some analysts consider a bachelor's degree or higher the kind of dividing point between the working and the middle classes. And so in this next slide, I want to break down that the population. So this slide solely represents the graduates of four-year institutions. So and it tracks out underemployment rates. And this data comes from economists at the Federal Reserve. And what they mean by underemployment is graduates of four-year institutions who are now working in jobs for which you do not need a college degree. Right? So they're talking about college graduates who are now employed in jobs that are traditionally considered part of the working class. And in that inset box, I've pulled up the latest data, and as you can see, the red line going across, that's all college graduates. And that's everyone between the ages of 22 and 65 who has earned a 4-year degree. And it's 1 out of 3 college graduates wind up in a job for which college degree was not a prerequisite. And if you look at recent college graduates, by which they mean every college grads between the ages of 22 to 27, then it's some 40%. 2 out of 5 college graduates wind up in a job that requires less than the education that they've received. And yeah, over time, particularly over the first decade of a person's work career, a certain absorption, people transform. The recent grads then wind up find jobs for which their education is a kind of an educationally appropriate work. The other thing to note, though, about this chart is that these levels of underemployment, and underemployment covers jobs such as customer service, retail, and sales and marketing jobs, lower level administration. I mean, many of the underemployed college graduates wind up in the supply chain system. And so looking at this chart, this phenomena of underemployment is not something new. It's been really a steady state part of higher education since the early 1990s. So the fact that higher ed has expanded, but that expansion has resulted in kind of pushing a certain number of graduates back down into the kinds of employment that they would have qualified for if they hadn't gone to college in the first place. Now, this chart here plots out the expansion of population on the left-hand side and college students on the right-hand side. And as you can see, college population expands much more rapidly than population. So there's this whole societal-wide shift towards the educational system and towards higher education. And at times, for instance, during the 1960s, the numbers of students attending college actually doubled. And again, in the early parts of this century, there's a very rapid expansion of higher ed. And this expansion occurs in when looked at demographically, has occurred in 3 major phases. And during the 1950s and 1960s, higher ed is expanding very rapidly, and consequently it begins to reach out to parts of the population who up until that point had by and large been excluded from the college scene. So during the 1950s and 60s, that means there's a much greater participation of women in higher ed, and no longer in a handful, or exclusively in a handful of majors that lead to teacher certification, since elementary and secondary school teaching at that point was one of the few professional fields that were open to women. The other group that starts to be absorbed in a large way during the 50s and 60s are students from working class backgrounds. I mean, there's some influx of working class adolescents into the collegiate system in the 1920s, particularly in metropolitan areas where particularly sons of immigrants begin to attend college. But it's not until the 50s and 60s that there's really a massive influx of working class adolescents from working class backgrounds into the collegiate system. So those are two new populations in higher ed. Then in 1970s and 80s, there are two other groups that begin to be incorporated into the educational system. And these are groups that were termed at the time underrepresented minorities. And in particular, the focus was on the recruitment African American students, and also then to what we call today Latinx students. The Latinx students, though, were not homogeneous in background, and were split really into two groups. On the East Coast, particularly the Northeast, the Latinx students were either immigrants or children or grandchildren of immigrants from Puerto Rico. Whereas on the West Coast and Southwest, the Latinx students were predominantly Mexican heritage, so at that time called Chicanos. And then 1990s, there's still newer groups incorporated into higher education, and that's then immigrants and the children of immigrants. And their kind of influx into higher ed is largely a result of the loosening of immigration laws during the 1970s and 80s that changed the focus of permissible immigration away from Northern Europe and becomes much more global, such that there's really very large-scale immigration from Eastern Europe, from Russia, from South Asia, India and Pakistan, from East Asia, from China in particular, from the Mideast, from Turkey, from all parts of Central and South America. And so these then become kind of a further groups that higher education draws on in order to expand enrollments. So the demographic picture is quite complex. And this then, using census categories, this shows the increase in student population by demographic category. And begins only in 1976 because it's only then that the Census Bureau begins to collect race and ethnicity data about college students. But one thing to note about this is that higher education expands fast enough that basically no one is turned away from the system. And so the rates of growth for different groups vary, but higher education accommodates everyone who wants to go to college, and there's a much greater sensibility amongst the population that higher ed is key to upward mobility. So couple of points to make about this data is one is that ideas about multiculturalism and diversity are crafted to fit this ever-changing dynamic amongst college students themselves, because pre-existing ideas, by and large, all held to a melting pot thesis, which was really another way of expressing ideas about Americanization. And the melting pot really projected into the future a standard that was based on white male Protestants who dominated higher ed up until the post-World War II period, and which implied a certain politics and also did no longer fit the reality. And so kind of multiculturalism then becomes a kind of a welcoming and embracing doctrine through which higher education can incorporate new students. It's also true, and multiculturalism was criticized heavily when it was first articulated as a doctrine, is because it diminished the role of race. And for many people, particularly coming out of the 1960s and the civil rights and New Left movements, understood that race was a dynamic that was much more difficult to confront, much more ingrained in the American psyche and in the structure of society. And that multiculturalism, while it was a welcoming doctrine in terms of kind of the breadth of the students coming into higher ed institutions, it 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 took the focus away from race in a way that many people felt was not helpful. And so, I mean, one way to understand critical race theory, it was that then out of those criticisms, critical race theory becomes very important as a way to refocus on race as a dynamic that's quite different from gender and ethnicity and other dynamics based on religion or sexual orientation and so on. Another point to make then is that people had already stopped talking about the working class in the pretty much in the post-war period as ideas that, you know, kind of classes were disappearing and that the United States was just really, there was just one social class, this one gigantic middle class with pockets at the top and the bottom for the very wealthy and the very poor. And working class had become a problematic idea also because it was very tough to identify concretely who this working class was. Many people identified the working class as the industrial working class, but the industrial working class was, you know, basically stagnating as in terms of numbers during the 1950s and 60s, and then, you know, relatively started to decline as a part of the population. And there was also great confusion about the difference between the working class and the middle class. And in a sense, then these new doctrines of multiculturalism and diversity avoided, you know, just avoided those issues and began to talk about students as either working class students as first generation, right? By definition, first generation student is working class. It means your parent or parents did not go to college. And insofar as a college degree signified middle class existence, then to refer to, you know, to first generation students and start to reorient institutions around those students became a kind of code for talking about the working class. Upward mobility is also another kind of coded way of talking about working class because upward mobility was never the motivation for the middle and upper classes. I mean, for the middle class, it was really the whole idea of college education for children was so that those children could more or less replicate the life with which they had grown up with. And so for the middle class, the motivation of sending children to college was either for a kind of lateral mobility, and so that children would still be as comfortable as previously as they had grown up, or it was the purpose of going to college was to avoid downward mobility into the working class. So the whole language of upward mobility is, again, it's focused on working class and this working class influx into higher education. And then, yes, there's a certain optimism behind multiculturalism, because while multicultural is a very optimistic doctrine, the universities are running up against the economic system in which it cannot absorb the numbers of students being graduated by the collegiate system. So it's really kind of, it shows a great disharmony between the evolution of the educational system and the inability of the economic system to keep pace with what the educational institutions are able to accomplish. So, and then briefly, just want to bring this data up to date. So it's that last bar on the bottom that brings us from 2010, 2011, really represents the peak of higher education enrollments. And there's been a fall off of some 10% since that time. This data takes it to 2020. There's been a slight revival since 2020 to 2023. But it still hasn't reached the level that it had reached in 2010. And insofar as projections are available, then they're available for the realistic projections for the next 10 years. During that time, they still won't reach the level they had attained in 2010. So, and this is the most dramatic falling off of higher ed enrollments that's ever been seen since its beginnings in the early 1800s. So basically, and what this data says then is that the era of multicultural optimism is really now behind us. And insofar as it still exists, it's kind of, it's kind of clutching onto a situation that existed for the entire post-war period, but which doesn't exist anymore. And this too, this brings us, the column on the right brings us up to 2020 in terms of the impact of this decline on the different major demographic groups and the population, in which it's really only groups that represent recent waves of immigration that are still expanding their college presence, and that for both white and black students, there has been a significant fall off in college. And it's not because colleges are turning students away, this system. I mean, we hear quite a bit about elite institutions and the intense competition that goes on in terms of getting admitted to them. But for the other 80+% of higher ed institutions, they could absorb thousands upon thousands of more students. So this is a kind of voluntary turning away of students of the population from higher education because they're pessimistic about the job situation, because of the debt situation that accompanies higher ed, and so on. There's been quite a bit of attention to the decline in black participation in higher ed, particularly because of the attacks on and rollback of affirmative action. But there's really been no attention to what's going on with the white population, except in kind of the, not as a student population, but as just in the white population in general, in terms of its generalized demoralization about how it sees itself in the future of the economy and in the country. So, and then, some general conclusions. But I'm going to end my comments on this note, since I know everyone is eager for discussion. So let me then yes, turn this back over to you. But I wanted to walk you through that data so as a way to kind of contextualize both where multiculturalism comes from as a doctrine, why it made so much sense, why it's been embraced so widely. I mean, of course, it's a doctrine that was theorized by professors and academics, but why it's been embraced so thoroughly and widespread throughout the college situation, and why it's really kind of, in a sense, identity politics, which are fueling the protests that we're now seeing around what's going on in Gaza with Palestinians and the Israelis. So, on that note,
Thank you. Thank you. Does anybody have a question for the speaker? You could go on stack like so, or raise your hand. Ryan.
Um, yeah, I guess I'm not sure if I guess I was just curious about hearing more what you were calling multicultural optimism. Is is by that do you mean like the I guess the ambition or whatever the attempt of the universities to like integrate more and more different populations and be able to bring them to the middle class? Is that what you mean by
yeah,
multicultural optimism?
exactly. Yes, I mean that's how higher ed really conceives its purpose in society, as kind of being as inclusive as possible and using education as a form of uplift. And then reaching out to newer populations, whether it's African Americans or immigrants or working class youth, and bringing them into the educational system, and assuming that the economy then can absorb them and give them, salaries and kind of, a level of work that speaks to their educational abilities. Yeah, and that's the optimism. Yeah.
Sam?
I don't know why there are balloons in my background, but thank you very much for your presentation. The data was really informative. I guess I had a bunch of questions, but one of them is about what the role of a college education is today, if returns on the investment, as it were, are diminishing. So what do you see as the function of institutions of higher education with regard to this, like, undergraduate students?
Yeah, it's a very tough question, and I don't think there's a very easy answer. And students sometimes ask me this question too, and um, in part, I think for individuals have to think about it not only as kind of the cost of education and kinds of job markets that exist out there, but also that, I mean, in a sense, what higher ed has been doing as it is it's been graduating students who then get pushed back down into the working class and kind of back towards where they began in the first place. But because they now have a college degree, they're more competitive on the job market. So so higher ed hasn't been altogether about upward mobility, as it has been in terms of making parts of the working class more competitive in terms of the working class kind of job market that they're about to enter. Um, so it's a kind of relative, in terms of the individual, it's a kind of relative advantage. In terms of employers, it means that employers tend to prefer college graduates over non-graduates. Um, they're very disciplined college graduates. They've had lots of experience working on their own, doing assignments, doing papers. They have lots of experience working on teams and kind of improving their communication skills. They know how to separate emotions from their work, and so kind of remove their personality from the task that they're assigned to do. And the data that we see is that employers will tend to pay college grads a higher salary than they would pay non-grads, even though the job doesn't require a college education. So it's the underemployed college graduates tend not to wind up working at places like Starbucks. They have kind of much greater success in terms of what you might call decently paying employment, and much greater success in finding full-time employment than non-grads. But it's a relative advantage. It's not this kind of middle-class utopia that higher ed still projects.
Dan?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the presentation. I think this has bearings on a Marxist political organization. And there is a sort of mythology that a lot of people that are Marxists have, which is that the working class is uneducated, and therefore, given that Marxism as a doctrine, as a tradition, puts a major onus on the development of theory for the masses, we have a mythology around theory in which says the narrative we're all familiar with, which is don't talk too much about theory because it so-called alienates workers. But if this presentation that we've heard this afternoon is correct, and I think that it is, the working class is far more educated and therefore far more open to what Marxism means as an intellectual enterprise. And the great thing about that, the blessing, despite all of the pessimistic conclusions one could draw from this data, is the fact that the elites don't care for propagating Marxism. Right. So there is a sort of opportunity, it seems to me, for the propagation of Marxist theory, given that there is this educational background and therefore a kind of prerequisite. That prerequisite's already satisfied. Right. So I'm giving you something which I think a lot of folks might disagree with. But I actually think that that's actually a rigorous opportunity for Marxism, because Marxism should go far beyond just an economic analysis of capitalism. Right. Marxism has a long tradition of building up and redefining what an intellectual is, and there's no better chance to do that at the moment in which the frameworks of understanding power and society from the elite colleges and universities are so incoherent to almost everyone, including themselves. So I wonder if you see the same possible optimism in terms of a broad sort of Marxist project of education for proletarianized but educated, college-educated working class people.
Yeah, I certainly. I mean, I think you've really put your finger on it. I mean, there's a really a sizable chunk of the working class now that's quite sophisticated in terms of it's been through a lot of education, 16 years of formal education, and you learn. You just don't learn discipline. You actually learn some ideas, and you're open to lots of things. And so, yes, I think it's quite possible to have a very sophisticated discussion amongst big sectors of the working class. And kind of this breakdown that I did in terms of college educated in general. I mean, if you look at labor movement data, it's almost an identical breakdown in which the members of unions who have a 4-year college degree are actually a larger group than the number of union members who have a high school diploma or less. So, and then if you include in again, union members with either a 2-year associate's degree or who went to college for some amount of time, a few months, few years, then you see that 2-to-1 ratio, and that kind of 2/3 of union members nationally have have been college students for some amount of time in their lives. And so again, it's much more, and then, I mean, I was just involved in the faculty strike at Rutgers, in which, I teach as an adjunct these days, in which, adjuncts won big, but the rhetoric from the union was really quite truncated and only spoke to us as workers when, here's faculty member who are also professionals and, and function on multiple levels. We're not just workers, but we're also intellectuals, we're also professionals. And so these traditional separation of these categories, I think, doesn't make sense in the way that they once did, and which I think a lot of political commentators and the media are still stuck on. I mean, they're looking at voting patterns in terms of people with college education and people without a college education. And for sure, there are distinctions and, and sometimes very quite large distinctions between those populations. But I'm not sure education per se is really the way to divide and understand the population or the working class.
If I could have one follow-up, I mean, it seems to me there was an effort on behalf of some sociologists influenced by Pierre Bourdieu, who really want to put an onus, and you still see this in working class studies in academia, of class origins as the primary.
Yes.
And I think, that's as dangerous as putting the immediacy of one's economic position as the primary. So I'm not convinced by it.
No.
Another thing I'm not convinced by the way, is this public sector unionization during the Biden era from elite schools, even Ivy League schools, where they're calling themselves workers. I feel that terminologically is a little bit of a disgrace to the true function of how value and prestige works in the Ivy Leagues, which is so fundamentally different than the culture of any working class organization. So if you are a grad student in an Ivy League school, I think you need to have the humility to recognize that difference. Would you agree? I don't know.
Yes, and I think actually it's one of the things I like about identity politics. I know it's probably the wrong group to be saying this to, but that I think identity politics, because it's so much about nuance and differences between people, that college students now have a kind of sensitivity to judging kind of whether they're trying to represent other people, or whether people should speak for themselves, and what the differences are between these various groups. And in that sense, I think it's quite refreshing, identity politics, because people just don't assume that their point of view is everyone's point of view, and so that aspect is encouraging.
I agree. And final point: as long as it doesn't get censorial, right? That's the sort of limit. As long as it doesn't get too perniciously censorship based, which it can. But you're right; it does have a kind of in nuce or primitive form of class consciousness embedded in it. It's a beginning point of a constant awareness, which it can be inclusive of class. But anyways, thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, and kind of further, I think kind of multiculturalism as kind of the socialism of our time, in that, kind of class politics up through really the 60s and 70s was so much focused on class that, people had a hard time either focusing on gender or understanding what it was all about, had, a great tendency to reduce race issues to economic issues, which they are to a great extent, but that it's not just it's more subtle. I mean, if you talk about difference between Afro-Caribbeans and African Americans, I mean, that's not, that's something much greater than just economics. And then sexuality, orientation, and differences, and ethnicity, Latinx population, Asian populations being very complex. So, the old socialism kind of was focused on class to the exclusion of these other dynamics. And today we have the focus on these other dynamics and almost an exclusion of class. And so, it's kind of these two things are kind of mirror images of one another, very dialectic in a sense, in which, we're still waiting for kind of the emergence of a synthesis that can really draw on these various traditions and put them together in a way that's, quite useful and healthy for people. So.
Caroline?
Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk about maybe the role of like student loan expansion, which I'm sure was probably like a mostly policy related decision, and how like was there, and this is kind of my maybe educated guess, was there like an internal shift in higher education that led it to kind of need loans from the government that were then like offloaded to the quote unquote consumer in terms of cost? Like, was there kind of a shift in starting to like treat the university more like a business in a very like concrete way? I guess I just want to see, how did the student loans fit into that picture?
Yeah, it's a very good question. In the 1970s, there was a major reshuffling of the world economy. And part of that was defunding of public education. And so public institutions in particular started to scramble and find ways of funding themselves, and eventually it led to privatization of cafeteria services and so on. But it was also at a time, kind of the Keynesian era, when large segments of the population had some amount of disposable income. Not everything went to necessities. And kind of with that in mind, and the fact that higher ed, needed to find other sources of funding, there was the start of a shift towards student loans. And it was a way in which higher education was privatized in a situation in which most of what higher education does, no one's interested in purchasing. So, you can offer a university's history department and try to privatize it, but, it's no one's going to make money off of it, right? I mean, higher ed, education in general, needs to be subsidized. So it's a quite ingenious kind of evolution of the system in terms of student loans. And it's a situation that's evolved, and there's no understanding it still yet in economic theory, that here's, in a sense, education has been privatized by means of student loans, so that students and or their parents need to pay for part of the education, and they pay for it now without actually owning any of it. And so very unique situation, but because universities and university expenses continued to expand, universities needed to find a way to fund themselves, and student loans and government funding on particularly state and federal levels have been the ways to do that. So it's kind of, the economic support for higher education isn't there anymore. And student loans, in a sense, were part of this kind of very complex entity that develops and evolves and can absorb more and more students, despite the fact that the economy can no longer afford higher education, and that the economy can no longer absorb its graduates. I mean, it's really kind of a sign of a very dysfunctional social system, moving in various directions, right? Uncoordinated, unplanned, dysfunctional, with part of the public trying to move the system in one direction and the system really being immovable.
Zachary?
Hi, Gary. Thank you for this talk. It was very enjoyable. I get my question kind of piggybacks, I guess, a little bit off of Caroline's. I was very surprised. I wasn't surprised by the big drop after 2010 in the graph, because of the 2008 financial crisis, of course. But I was very surprised that it never really recovered. Uh, is that just because of like some kind of anemic thing in the U.S. economy that they were not able to, like, people aren't able to get loans, or are people making the decision that it's not worthwhile to get a loan to go to college? Like, what happened after that 2008 crisis that number kind of never went back up?
Yeah, it's a few things. I mean, the loans, you can borrow an enormous amount of money to go to college, and so the money is there, and it's also, there's tons of room for students. If you want to go to college, there are many colleges that will accept you. Doesn't matter what high school you've gone to. Doesn't matter what, how you did on the PSATs and so on. There are, something like half of all four-year liberal arts colleges basically working on an open admissions uh, um, platform, in which, if you have a high school diploma and can pay the tuition, you will be admitted to a college. So yeah, it's the economic situation, and the kind of growing awareness that many jobs will not pay sufficient amounts of money that you could pay off a lot of student debt quickly, that it will continue to drag you down for a decade or two after graduation. Um, it's also the case that immigration has tightened considerably. And so that's, kind of influx of college age students as part of those immigration waves were important to higher education. Um, and yeah, and so yeah, I think, how you summarized it was right. That's people perceive, people are much better educated and much more quickly educated about things than um, they were previously. Yeah, I mean, much of the working class, for instance, paid attention to this information about the wealthier. I think it was Carolyn who raised this issue about wealthier people, sending their children to college at much greater rates of success. And there's, been a lot of work done to show, well, just how does wealth convey advantages? Well, in terms of hiring tutors and special classes for children and focus on academics and so on. And many, many, working class families have reoriented themselves according to that knowledge about what it takes to be successful to get your child into college, right? Guidance counselors now talk about this stuff. There's workshops for parents, for kids, and so on, mentoring programs, college prep programs. So you really have kind of this whole reshaping of the population around higher education. At the same time, they're absorbing then kind of these kind of dismal economic outcomes, such that it's not guaranteed that just because you go to college that a nice career is going to open up to you. So I think it's and that regardless of what seems to be the race towards the bottom in terms of kind of an awareness of the political situation, in terms of kind of everyday life, in terms of education, I think it's a much more sophisticated population that's paying attention to what's going on.
Daniel.
Hi. So thanks. I have a couple questions. So I read your essay in the Brooklyn Rail, and there's a really great line in there I want to share here, copy and paste it into the chat. You're talking about the college-educated precariat, and you say these are middle-class aspirants with working-class lives. While major parts of the working class think of themselves as middle class, parts of the middle class are adjusting in reverse fashion. Yeah, that really stuck with me. And so one question I wanted to ask you was about, ideology how it works in this context? What are the kind of, necessary illusions perhaps people need to nurture in order to cope with these things? And, sometimes people talk about split consciousness. It's usually more like in a racial context, like Du Bois and stuff like this. But, it seems to me like you have working class people who don't think of themselves as working class, or some other mixture of some other kind of thing. And that seems like a kind of ideological, seems to me that what's going on, there's some kind of, ideological function obscuring things. You pay all this money to go get a credential. It's basically gatekeeping. Then you get this credential, and now you're somehow supposed to be special, and you're not just a worker. I was wondering, what do you think this situation gives rise to in terms of ideology, and what are the sort of prospects politically, or the horizon? What does the horizon look like politically? I mean, I've heard that it's going to get worse when the children who would have been born in 2008-9 weren't born because of the recession. When those people would have entered college 18 years later, but don't because they don't exist, the enrollments are going to drop even farther. And so, it just seems like, it's a bleak future. And I was just wondering what you thought the political horizon looks like. If it's a bunch of people in this situation, can they be a political actor? Can they do anything? What do we have to expect?
Yeah, well, that's a very hard question to answer. But I have my crystal ball right here. So, yeah, I'm not sure we can really predict into the future too much. I mean, we certainly, as you've said, we can put our finger on lots of areas in which kind of ideological commitments and ideas are not so firmly rooted anymore. For instance, working class parents who raise their children to go to college and become middle class, right? So really kind of functioning in two dimensions, just from that alone. Or, students, who have, aspirations to become middle class only to find them, find their way forward blocked. So, that kind of, because of the economic dysfunction, it tends to prompt people to kind of, you have to rethink your assumptions about reality. And it's kind of that inability to move forward and the kind of deep-seated dissatisfaction and unhappiness that provokes, that opens up parts of the population, and maybe even significant parts of the population, to different kinds of ideas. But I'm not sure, that we can say with any kind of finality what direction exactly people will move in. Whether they'll find, Donald Trump attractive, or whether they'll think that, Joe Biden might still save them, or whether, they'll move on to further ideas. The fact that we keep seeing protest movements reemerge, like the pro-Palestinian movement that has unfolded, or Black Lives Matter, not so long ago, or Occupy, or, and so on, kind of shows us that dissatisfaction with society, continues to boil over. And so, for me, that's a reason for optimism, and that, despite the bleakness of how the situation appears, so people nonetheless continue to respond in kind of radically positive ways in terms of protest. And so, more than that, I'm not sure I can say. And
Andy.
I also think we don't really have a blueprint for moving forward. It's not like, we're not coming out of a successful labor movement that thinks all it has to do is keep growing. We've seen lots of things attempted in terms of movements and seizures of governments and planning and unplanning and so on. And so, kind of lessons of the past tend to be more negative than positive. No, nonetheless, we still, can think about, if people are to move in a radical direction, how might they do that? What can they do on their own behalf in a very immediate way?
Did you have a follow-up question, Dan?
Well, I thought about maybe just clarifying. I guess what I meant is it seems like certainly since the 60s, until now, and this may be wrong, but it seems so to me. And then, in my lifetime since Occupy, there's been a certain kind of characteristic way in which people, when they get radicalized, act politically. And I'm thinking of basically you just go to some protest or something, and this is all sort of, decentralized, horizontal, spontaneous, the kind of DSA brand sauce here, and it doesn't leave anything that lasts. It's like riding on the beach. It just gets washed away when the tide comes up, and that happens every day. So I guess what I meant is this fractured kind of consciousness where it seems like I'm not a worker. I'm a credentialed expert in my field. Could contribute to this kind of scatterbrained politics that millennials have been perpetuating since Occupy. Was kind of my thought. Does that check out at all?
Well, yes and no. I mean, certainly kind of, the politics of spontaneity are quite limited because it comes and goes. On the other hand, to have an organization means that, if you're going to be successful, then you have to accommodate yourself to the social system. Because if you're in perpetual opposition, you either will become irrelevant because you're too much opposed and people aren't there with you, or you're just going to be crushed. And the security agencies are stronger than ever, and so that's part of the dilemma. I think if on the one hand, kind of the dream of building a powerful organization, and when we look at political parties or unions or whatever, they become as much a part of the problem as they are in opposition to other parts of the problem themselves. On the other hand, there's a politics of spontaneity, which is very decentralized and very vibrant in some respects, but it's very tough to sustain those kinds of energies. And yeah, it conjures up certain ideas of a kind of an alternative radical culture. But that also then means, an ability to live on the margins of society. And that tends to be a very tough existence. And, large portions of the working class already live that kind of marginalized life. And it's nothing to romanticize. So, again, it's part of, if the past doesn't really have any way forward for us, then I mean, I think that's the problematic that has to be articulated, and and people need to be encouraged to kind of start thinking their way through it. That there isn't an ideology or a platform that's going to do it for us.
Caleb? Caleb, are you there? Okay, sure. I have a question. Gary, I don't know if you had a chance to look at our statement of principles. I have a question related to the middle class or identity politics, but maybe if I could first just get your thoughts um, on our principles, which are um, that the reason the left today is so dysfunctional is because it's been split from the working class, specifically the industrial working class, and has become largely a middle class movement, which uh, uh, which prevents it from pursuing a universal class politics. What do you think about that? Um, and what do you think about, uh, well, I guess you already talked about identity politics, but what do you think about the issue of the working class in the left?
Um, well, I don't. I'm not sure middle class really exists. I mean, the middle class is really part of the working class, but what distinguishes it is that it self-identifies as a middle class, and so, but looked at in terms of Marxian terms or class terms or economic terms, the middle class also works for a living. And even professors, Daniel, need to collect that paycheck. So yes, in some ways it's helpful to talk about a middle class, and certainly the left traditionally has attracted many members of the middle class, but generally as it's a portion of the middle class that identified its own interest and its own future with the working class, and so there was a kind of an identity of interest that brought people together. I yeah, I don't set any special kind of score on the left. It's certain, I function within the left when the writing that I do is for that audience, and so but the politics that interest me are politics that look to embrace the entire working class and not just particular portions of it. And it's a kind of distinction between the left and the working class that I'm not sure is so helpful. As opposed to kind of collections of people or groups of people, or a left that is kind of the class conscious part of the working class, but which doesn't position itself as something other than part of that wider working class. And it's the way that I find most helpful to think about social life. And it also, for me, it most closely expresses my politics as kind of identifying with the working class. But it's the working class writ large, not just the traditional industrialized working class.
Andy?
Hi, thanks for coming to speak to us today. It's been a good discussion. So yeah, I was later in the stack, so I think some people have already touched on some of these themes, so apologize if it seems a little duplicative, but I thought it was unique enough to still contribute. So lately I've been thinking about this role of like, what does politics look like? Like what are the determining factors? Is it more ideological, or is it more based upon people's economic positions, like concretely in society? And so with that in mind, like, you were talking about the percentage of the population going to college, and that 44% of them haven't been able to be able to land the kind of middle class, white collar jobs that they were kind of expecting out of college. So to what extent do you think like the politics of our time are kind of shaped by people's economic position within American society versus people's consciousness just being shaped by the fact that they had just went to college? I guess another way to put it is like I've heard this cliche before that the Bernie Sanders movement was largely a phenomenon of that 44% that didn't get the kind of jobs that they were expecting, that a lot of his social base was based upon those college educated folks who ended up with working class jobs. To what extent do you think that that's true or untrue?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I haven't seen any data on Bernie Sanders supporters. I suspect it's just a slander committed against him, though. Um, yeah, yes, his supporters may be more highly educated, and there is this college educated kind of working class out there, and um, and certainly, higher education is very progressive institutions in general. It's, and institutionally speaking, it's probably no other as progressive place in society as higher education. So lots of ideas are going to ferment out of that. But people's everyday experiences are the result of not only what they're reading and hearing, but also what they're experiencing. And a lot of their experiences are economically based. And we know that some people can be ideologically committed, and they stay committed regardless of what's happening economically. The evangelical movement, for instance, are kind of so fixed on certain ideas that that no matter how they get treated by the people that they support, they stick with them nonetheless. And so very firm ideological attachment. Other people, though, you can see really kind of reeling because of what's happening economically and are rethinking their allegiances, rethinking their, much of the demonstrators and college crowd who were critical of Biden, but who the Democrats pretty comfortably thought were in their camp, on now rethinking their commitment because of what's going on in terms of Gaza. So there's a kind of educationally based rethinking of what's going on. So I mean, I don't think we could. It's very difficult to know where people are going to head ahead of time, and it's really generally only as people start to move and change and or stay fixed to ideas and so on, that we can then start to understand what's been the important factors motivating them and determining their actions. But in terms of anticipating what will happen, I think there's radicals and really commentators in general have particularly bad track records predicting the future. And certainly in terms of timing, I mean, the world evolves much more quickly than people respond to it, because consciousness is, doesn't have that kind of nimbleness that the social system itself or that characterizes the social system. So consciousness typically lags what's going on economically.
If I skipped over anyone, I apologize, and just let me know so I can call on you. We have a question from Caleb, whose mic isn't working. What purpose do more exclusive institutions like Harvard serve if they have mostly the same education as everyone else? And why have many, like Columbia, embraced these protest movements like Palestine despite being mostly upper class?
Yeah, I mean, well, these days the truly elite institutions are much more diverse than kind of second and third tier institutions. And in part, they're so diverse because they're so wealthy, and because they can some 20% of students at Ivy League schools now are Pell eligible. And Pell grants are based on economic need, and so really coming from probably the bottom third of the population, and it's because those institutions have such big endowments that they can now offer basically cost-free educations to students who attend. So, for instance, in New Jersey, where I teach at the State University. But for most income groups, it's actually cheaper to go to Princeton than it would be to attend the State University, which is Rutgers, because of the level of financing. So the elite institutions have changed dramatically over the last 2 decades because of the intense amount of criticism of them as elite institutions. And part of what we're seeing, I think, in terms of the encampments, particularly, kind of began all at elite institutions and now have kind of spread out to some state universities and other liberal arts colleges. Almost all of them are generally selective institutions, is that the population attending those institutions has changed along with the demographics of the country. And that's part of the reason why these institutions, why these have been, I think, the places of protest. And higher ed is a very liberal place in general, and you're exposed to all sorts of ideas and people that you wouldn't be exposed to if you were just working. I don't know if I've adequately answered your question, but
does anybody else have a question or a comment? Ryan.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. I thought it was interesting that you connected. It seems like you were kind of connecting like critical race theory to like a criticism that came out of the 60s. Is that right?
Yes, I mean the 1960s, there was a great focus on poverty, racism, the situation for African Americans in general, and to the degree that people understood less how to handle ethnicity as a dynamic. So there's great focus on race. The feminists brought in gender as a dynamic, and then the gay liberation movement brought in sexuality. But with multiculturalism, it embraced everyone really on an equal basis. But people already understood then that race was very different from ethnicity in terms of how people are treated and just how intransigent some of those bigotries and hatreds are. And so, yes, in a sense, multiculturalism got criticized for downplaying race as a dynamic at the same time that critical race theory became kind of grew in terms of people who were writing in that tradition, and race then came. The discussion of race was reformulated by that current.
Yeah, I guess so. I guess I was just curious how you. I mean, I guess there's not really a black and white way to answer this, but I guess because you kind of touched on it before. I mean, do you see it as ideologically functioning as a way of like introducing nuance, or I mean, like, or is it like, are we kind of like stuck in the 60s? I mean, it's just interesting because I mean, it does seem like it also influences the activism that we've been talking about. I mean, the way people like kind of include things in activism for particular like issues, like kind of including like these different like category. I don't know if that's how related that is,
Yeah,
but
no,
I mean, how
no,
do you see it?
I think that's right. I mean, for instance, have people having a much deeper understanding of how race works, such that you can take a look at how white and black and Latinx EMTs respond to someone who's being arrested and is in physical distress. And, you can understand the response based on the skin color of the person being arrested. I mean, that's a kind of level of understanding and a nuance that, and it's been, it's a level of understanding that now many people understand precisely because they're schooled in critical race theory, and because there's been social movements that focus on those dynamics and bring them to a wider public, and that's quite significant, I think, in terms of deepening our understanding of race relations, and also our appreciation of just how deeply seated it is that emergency medical responses also have their kind of color code.
We're getting to time here. I believe we have one question left. Gary, is that all right with you?
Sure. Yeah.
Dan Tutt.
Oh, sorry. I'm back again. I enjoyed this so much. I think one of the points on ideology that was just talked about, I just wanted to build off of. I think it does matter to contextualize this in relationship to the history of the New Left. And one of the things that happened with the New Left was a sort of exaggerated politicization of students as a revolutionary subject, and therefore of the university and the ideas generated by it as partially causally, in a causal sense, responsible, I would say, for what we now today call hyperpolitics, right? Which is the sort of politicization of everything, which has only been heightened in the wake of Donald Trump. And so, in my view, the university, as strategists to strategize as the future of socialist politics, should be seen in a hostile relationship to socialism, precisely because the ideas that are generated from the university will have that exaggerated effect. And that also is tied into the media apparatus, because they want to politicize, because the conservatives rely on the canard and the fake stereotype of the cultural Marxist professor, when we all know that most professors are very far from Marxism, right? So there needs to be a profound clarification on the true politics that emanate from the university. And perhaps that's something that we could do as an organization, or that socialist groups could do.
Yes. I mean, one of the things that strikes me about the 60s too is that, college education in those days, everyone assumed that meant middle class. And the majority of students were from the middle and upper classes still in those days. And, higher ed had started to expand, big influx of working class kids. But these was still, it was a higher ed traditionally had been a middle class phenomena. And as much as the left focused on parts of the working class, particularly African Americans, and protested against the harsh treatment and the economic conditions to which they were subjected to, the left never really declared itself its own class position. And many of the leftists then left universities in order to go find the working class. People moved, quit college, went into the factories, and so on. And I think it's now been enough time and enough evolution of the population, and with the expansion of higher ed, that we can now say, well, universities are a place where you find a good portion of the working class itself. And so, there's a kind of way to focus on universities as, I'm reluctant to call them workplaces, even though students do work. I mean, it's, they do work though, but they pay to do the work rather than getting paid for it. But so there's a kind of reconceptualization of the university and the role of students in society that we're ripe for, in a way that I think some of that fetishization of universities as sites of struggle that went on in the 60s. We'll see with this recent wave of protests. I mean, it's probably all going to come to a sudden end now with graduation. I mean, I would think graduation ceremonies this year will be very exciting. But once graduation is over, I'm not sure there's going to be enough people around to continue camping out. So we'll have to see what happens in the fall and next year. But yeah, it's a very different situation going on in school settings.
I think we can call it there. It was a great discussion. Thank you for everyone who came. Thank you especially to our speaker, Gary. Maybe we can have you on again sometime.
Yeah, great. I appreciate being here. Thanks to Daniel for setting this up, and yeah, good discussion. Very good discussion. So thanks.